Hello, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Faith, and this is an introduction to a paper that I'm currently writing. Thresholds and the Feminine Body in the work of Ithell Colquhoun. So our plan of action, we will begin with an introduction, then we'll go into a bit of a biography before looking at aspects of her as a writer, an occultist, and an artist. We will look at how her work was transgressive and also empowering, and then look at the feminine body and sex in her work. Then we'll have a conclusion, I'll show you my bibliography, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. After dark, be careful of your door, should you hear a faint knocking. Do not open, because of what may fall across the threshold. After midnight, be careful of your door, should you come home late, watch keenly where you tread, because of what may lie along the threshold. The work of Ithell Colquhoun exists at a crossroads of surrealism, occultism, and sexuality. We cannot really approach her work without understanding that these three are intermixed within her entire body of work. Her art is very much the art of transformation. It is the art of change, of spiritual development, of enlightenment and growth in many ways. The threshold is a key theme within her body of work. And when we speak of the threshold, we're talking about liminality. We're talking about the ambiguous, the obscure, the unknown, the place of the in-between. It's often a place of struggle or trial, sometimes pain. There are different aspects of the threshold as well. We have the threshold in the physical space around us, represented by doors or by windows. We have it in the natural landscape, where the ocean meets land, in daybreak or in sunset. These are also liminal spaces. Very importantly in her work, the threshold in the liminal space is also that within consciousness, between dream and reality, waking and sleeping, mind and body, between the different aspects of self. The feminine body in her work is the site of this transformation and functions as a liminal space. She uses the feminine body to express transgression and also to empower the feminine body. She writes in Children of the Mantic Stain, one of her theoretical texts, "Does not all inspiration come from the multitudinous abyss?" She was born in 1906 to British parents in India. Her father worked for the British government in India, but she was raised on the Isle of Wight by her aunt before she attended the Slade School of Fine Art in London. Her early works usually depicted biblical narrative and myth. And we can see from a very young age she was fascinated by the feminine role in a lot of biblical narrative and myth. And the feminine body as well. She was looking at it as a place to kind of challenge a lot of narratives. Here is Death of Lucretia, where Lucretia is in that sort of liminal space between life and death. In the nude as well, she had just been raped, but before committing suicide, she has her husband and father vow vengeance upon her. It's important when looking at her work that her magical worldview was one of eminence as opposed to transcendence. For her, God was not far away and sort of obscure, but God was to be found, or the divine was to be found in the world around us, in the body, in the natural landscape, in the book of life. She writes in 1930, "Under the doctrine of signatures, planet and herb, metal and deity, beast and precious stone, the months of the year and the parts of the human body were linked in subtle communion, so that one could not indeed stir a flower without the troubling of a star." And this shows us how she kind of viewed everything linked and connected. She was also an animist. Everything around her, the natural world, as well as the human body, was sort of innately divine. She was also, this also kind of shows her early understanding of occultism. She was reading occult texts from a very young age. She was very familiar with Thomas Vaughan, Irenaeus Philalethes, also known as George Starkey, She read Jakob Burma, Basil Valentine, Swedenborg. She was very well read in all of these, and they had a profound effect on everything that she kind of created. She was also a writer. She wrote so many works. This is just a taste. There are scores of unpublished essays and unfinished novels at the Tate Archive in Britain. But these are just a few. We have the travelogues. We have Gustav Hermogenes, which we'll get into. It's a supremely alchemical text. The Sword of Wisdom is actually the first biography written on MacGregor Mathers and the Golden Dawn. Osmazone was a collection of poems and illustrations. And then the two in the top right, Medea's Charms and I Saw Water, were posthumously published by Richard Shillito. So her worldview and her spirituality was syncretic in almost every way. She was raised in the Anglican Church, and we see heterodox Christian themes as a fundamental thread through her work. She was involved with countless occult orders, members of many, not initiated into many. She was headstrong, she was very discerning, and this might have had a role in her initiation into some and not into others. She was a member of the Theosophical Society, the OTO, the Quest Society. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, however, was the school of thought that she was most involved in. She was not ever initiated into the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. We don't know exactly why, but she worked with those teachings, especially the Kabbalah, esoteric color theory, a lot of these aspects. She was very influenced by the work of Jung, as we'll see, with her sort of spiritualized alchemy. And ritual, dreams, and divination were huge components of her work, both in her personal life and her personal practice, as well as the techniques and rituals that she used to write and to paint. They're also the liminal space that she would enter in herself to create her work. She was an alchemist in many ways, and she worked through her ideas and practiced alchemy through her art. Gustav Hermogenes, as I mentioned before, is her alchemical text. The titles of the chapters are even named after different stages in alchemical development. She writes in 1961 from Gustav Hermogenes, "My true ancestor, the alchemist's white woman, lunar progenitrix, it seems that some ritual is wanting. What can I do? Mother of good counsel, help me. Ark of the covenant, gate of heaven, it were not right ever to cease lamenting." And this really shows the syncretic nature of her work. We see sort of a heterodox Christian thread, as well as the alchemy, as well as the Celtic lore that really influenced her. So she would enter a liminal space, as I've said, to create her works, and she would practice automatisms, which were also key to the Surrealist movement at the time. And for her, automatism was a way to sort of connect both the Surrealist practices of her work as well as her spiritual and alchemical practice. She writes, "I feel these automatic stains to have a mantic or divinatory power. They may in some sort be compared with the practices of clairvoyance. In many fascinating psychological studies, Jung has shown how the alchemist would release the contents of his own fantasy world by intently watching the contents of the alembic." So she would use these automatic methods, but then sometimes take it a step further to kind of step apart from reality and kind of step away from rationality to sort of to let her imagination come forward, come through this irrational part of the conscious mind. And then with her will and rationality, she would then sort of shape these images. Here we have Gorgon from 1946, a cross-section of either testes or ovum cut through, and we have either the sunrise or the sunset on either side. So we see this kind of threshold, this sort of obscure space. There were a lot of talks in the Surrealist communities about the role of male and female. And while there was a claim or sort of a move towards equality of the sexes, this was not really her experience. And she challenged a lot of the sort of objectification, subjectification, and sort of dualistic nature of a lot of sexuality in these communities and during this time. Many of you all may know, but the Surrealists were very influenced by the work of the Marquis de Sade. And that entailed sort of a mechanization of bodies and sort of a victim-tyrant sort of power dynamic, and she was not a fan of that at all. She writes in 1943, "No more tyrants and victims, no more fevered alternations of that demon star which sponsored the births of de Sade and von Sacher-Masoch, but the hermaphrodite whole, opposites bound together in mitigating embrace by a silkworm's thread." And this really shows the alchemical nature of her understanding of sexuality and of the body, that it was about equality between the sexes and the feminine and the masculine, not one higher or more powerful than the other. This is kind of her, perhaps how she saw how intimate union could be. We have this sort of vulval cave, this kind of opening, this threshold, and then we have these two, what could be bodies, sort of enveloped with each other. We have the yellow sulfuric masculine sulfur with the feminine lunar mercurial together in union equally. She was also, she also used the double image, which was one of Dali's tricks, who she was especially had an affinity with. And the double image works by taking images or objects that are seemingly disparate and conflicting and combining them in a way to jolt one's perception and one's sense of reality, to get them to see new possibilities for reality. So the idea is that by changing what is within, you can also change the reality of what is outside. This is Pitcher Plant in 1936, which is one of her earlier works. And when we look at it off the bat, you know, it looks like a plant, possibly an insect. We might most certainly notice the phallus and testes, but upon closer inspection, it's also a vulva with the foliage, sort of consuming the phallus and consuming the testes. It is also the unity of opposites. We have then the female vulva and the male sex joining in one. Some art historians have interpreted this as well as sort of a vagina dentata, that the vulva is actually consuming the penis, highlighting men's insecurities and sexual fears. This piece caused quite a controversy in the gallery that it was to be shown at. They actually had her take it down, which she was not happy about. This is Gouffre Amer. And here we have a masculine physical body lounging on the landscape, kind of one with the landscape. And traditionally, you know, the woman's, you know, the female form is usually lounging and is very much kind of this object of this, you know, erotic sort of natural, you know, vegetation. But she's experimenting with the inverse of that. Here we have a masculine body laid out in a very kind of feminine pose. His penis is a blooming orchid. And so she's totally subverting the object-subject gaze and showing the masculine as more of a feminine form. And while this may seem a bit cruel, she's also, in a way, turning the male form into a vegetation deity, though. And so she's also portraying the body as inherently connected to nature. This is Tree Anatomy from 1942. And this piece shows the threshold of the vulva, but it is also an expression of the boundary, which is also really important in her work. Because not only is the threshold an opening with which we are welcomed into, but it also shows the power in the female form allowing or saying no and stopping that entry. We also have, again, the subversion or the transgression against the male gaze. What would typically be the object of voyeurism is now an exhibitionist. And we see power in that. Additionally, we see it's also the whole of a tree, this vulva. And so again, it's this sort of deification, sort of a tree deity of the female sex. This is her most popular and well-known piece, Scylla, from 1938. When we look at it right away, it looks like two penises touching heads. When we look at it a little closer, however, it is actually a female body lounging in a bath, gazing at her own thighs while she bathes. And her thighs form these cliffs or rocks. So, and the boat here is representative of the phallus, coming towards the female center, almost to try to perhaps penetrate her. But her legs form this threshold, a sort of dangerous threshold. This boat almost looks like it doesn't stand a chance, sort of nearing on what would usually be a very feminine, soft shape. Her legs are now powerful and dangerous. So we turn now to her writing, which is so rich with these examples of transgression and empowerment in the feminine body and with sexuality. She writes in Goose of Hermogenes, and I'll give a bit of context. In this book, we have our narrator, and she is imprisoned on an island with her alchemist uncle, who is a little creepy. But she goes on these walks through the gardens, and she meets this man, and they have sort of a tryst. And here she's performing a blood ritual. She writes, and this, I believe, was written with automatic methods. So there's, it's a bit poetic, and so if I seem out of breath, that's probably why reading it. She writes, I open my veins to the east. I open the veins of my arm with the cut of a sliver of silicon. Blood pours out from the left, flows out till it reaches the sea, goes on flowing, pours inexhaustible through the inexhaustible sea, without chafe or pause, till it surrounds the island, a line veining marble, a red line in the green sea taut from my arm, making a long arm to his home, circling the island, a ribbon of stain in the foam, unmoving like a rush chain to bind him. And this is important on multiple levels. First, she is creating a cut in her arm, opening a threshold in her own body, and pouring her blood into the earth to go down and connect with the sea. Bodily fluids are very much taboo. Additionally, we could read this as her menses and her menstrual blood flowing down and sort of creating a sort of a communion with the earth flowing into the sea, and then creating this sort of blood magic. Additionally, she does not ever consummate her relationship with this man who she's doing this blood magic love spell on. And so the moral of that is kind of that she, that self-development or spiritual growth is not reliant on romantic union, that she's performing this spell for herself, for her own growth, that is not reliant on whether this relationship ever actually develops or not. In this scene, it's towards the end of the story, and this is one of the final trials that she has to go through before she's finally liberated from her imprisonment on this island. She is drugged, and so she's put into this liminal state of kind of this strange kind of dream. She might have implied kind of an astral travel. And she is roped to a statue of Pan, who she kisses, and then this happens. She writes, selecting a pliable wand from a bundle lying beside it, he began to whip me, while the music increased. Every lash sent a shudder of delight through me. I saw that my flanks were speckled with blood, yet I felt no pain from the strokes, only a stinging, unbearable titillation. Clouds of unknown color and texture were racing past me, wild coruscations of light, shape, and hue. Then at a stroke keener than the rest, in a final eruption of music, an icy jet coursed through me to my fullest limbs, and I fell insensible. So here we have this woman, and she's held captive, and she's tied up, and she's being whipped. But instead of pain and fear, she actually is whipped to orgasm, to sexual ecstasy. And it is through her orgasm that she then collapses insensible. And then the next morning she wakes up, and it's the final stage, essentially, to her freedom. And what's important about this is that it's her sexual pleasure, it's the female body in this weird, ambiguous, liminal state that then becomes a source of empowerment. Female pleasure, was also a discussion point in many surrealist groups. Whether both people could, experience pleasure simultaneously, or if, it always had to be at the expense of one or the other. And I believe that through this passage, she's challenging that female pleasure is important, and it is a means to transgress and then also to empower. And I chose the volcano image here because Colquhoun was fascinated by the volcano, both as a symbol of sexual pleasure, but it's also sort of an ambiguous, sexually ambiguous symbol. It could be both masculine and feminine. And gender actually was quite non-essentialist for her, and I'll go more into that into my paper if anyone's interested. So to conclude, the threshold in Colquhoun's artworks and writings function as a site of transgression and empowerment. The feminine body acts as a liminal space of this transformation. Colquhoun herself entered altered states of consciousness to create and explore her own process of psycho-spiritual development. So she was going into her own imagination, and she was exploring these spaces of liminality and perhaps discomfort and obscurity to explore these themes of power dynamics and sexual dynamics. There is so much work still to be done on her, on the whole entire body of work. She has countless, probably hundreds of paintings, journals, unpublished novels, and essays at the typewritten. She has a tarot. She's also, she wrote many works and created meditation plates of the 10 Sephira to meditate on. There's just so much still to be done with her. I have quite a bibliography going. If anyone wants to know more, I can point you in the right direction. Thank you so much.
Thank you for a very lively presentation. Wonderful introduction to fascinating items. I'm sure there are questions.
I wonder, was she first a painter or a writer?
Was she first a writer?
Yeah, was she first a painter or a writer?
I'm not sure.
Well,
Well, it was both. So a lot of times for example, for Goose of Hermogenes, we know that she wrote it throughout the 30s and the 40s, even though it wasn't published until 1961. And to try to help get it published, she did a series of watercolors to try to kind of help with its allure, to make it more profitable. So the image that I showed with the one quote of the two bodies, and they were kind of floating, she created that to support her work. But she would also often create artworks and then write essays to try to develop the ideas in them further. Because a lot of people would look at her work and not really get it. And a lot of people took a bit of offense to sort of the transgressive and kind of challenging nature. And so she started publishing some of her articles in different journals, kind of explaining her techniques and explaining her ideas, because it seems that she may have felt like she was misunderstood. Yeah, so it was both.
For instance, when it comes to doing, it seems as if it's paintings or just writing. So it was first writing and then paintings.
Yeah, it was both. She was painting. I think she writes somewhere that she can't remember a time in her life, even in her young life, when she wasn't painting. And she had journals, especially dream journals, which she kept her entire life from a very, very young age. So she was always creating and always actively engaging with kind of different spiritual ideas and practices.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I wonder, how did she work with it when she painted? Was it like some sort of channeling? Was it in trance states?
Yeah. So for her, the act of often writing and painting was ritualistic.
Yeah.
She was really, she was quite passionate about the whole process of going into these altered states of consciousness to create her work. She was quite strict about it and actually quite disciplined. And she even challenged, I think in Vatican II, when they relaxed a lot of the sort of Catholic ritual, she was very critical of that, because she found that she thought that the Catholic ritual is really important and that it shouldn't be easy to enter these altered states, that it should be a practice, that it should be sacred in a way. And very much so, she has a niece who in an interview writes that she had this big mirror, and she would rope herself to the mirror and then lay a shawl over her head and then sit in there staring herself, or who knows doing what, working with the mirror in this kind of ritualistic space for very long periods of time. And she was very strict about like no noise ever being made and all of this. And then also when she would create her works, the story goes that she would be in her studio for very, very long periods of time, kind of in this, in sort of a divinatory kind of altered state to create her works. Because it was a two-step process for her. The first step would be to sort of surrender the rational mind and kind of surrender the will, and then to kind of create these automatic sort of stains, is what she kind of called them. And there were many different sort of methods and different kinds of automatic stains. But then for her, it was also important that a human uses their will and uses their rationality, to not surrender completely kind of to the unknown. And then she would then impart her imagination and develop these stains in a divinatory way, which is why she calls it the mantic stain. Mantic kind of from the Greek mania, and kind of these practices of divination. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thanks for the wonderful presentation. It's really interesting. I was wondering, like, how she connected with the surrealist movement of Breton.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking. I really wanted to speak more about that, but I had to be pithy. So she had a really complicated relationship with the surrealists. She discovered them while she was at the slave school through pamphlets by Breton. And then she went to the 1936 London Surrealist exhibition, and she was very much moved, especially by Dali's talk when he's in the scuba gear and he almost suffocates and all of this, but she was really moved by that. And from that time in 36, you can really see the surrealist influence on her work. In 1939, she joined the surrealist group in London, but she was actually only an official member for 1 year, because the leader of the London surrealists, E.L.T. Messens, he wrote up this whole thing, this contract, and it had 3 stipulations. That you couldn't be in the surrealist group and be a member of any of the occult orders. You had to be aligned to their political ideas, and you couldn't partake in any artistic or political groups or activities that weren't in alignment with the surrealist group. And she said, absolutely not, I'm not signing that document. And so he kicked her out and excommunicated her, and that really plagued her artistic sort of life from there on out. We even have stories where she was doing poetry readings. Her and her husband, Tony Del Renzio, who was also a surrealist, they had a very tumultuous relationship. But they went on to kind of try to do their own thing with surrealism, independent, and that caused, it was kind of his idea. He caused a lot of problems within the group. But anyway, it haunted her. There's even stories where the London surrealists showed up at a poetry reading of hers and started throwing food at her, because kind of this schism that was caused both by her being very discerning and very independent, and then also with her now ex-husband causing problems as well. So it was very complicated, but her artwork remained very much surrealist. She wrote on surrealism. She still kind of identified as a surrealist for pretty much her entire life. And she communicated with, she had letters back and forth with Breton for many years, as well as Max Ernst, Kurt Seligman. She was very much involved in many ways with the surrealists and with the occultists.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering with regards to the arts and imagination that you were talking about. And you talked about altered states and the automatic writing or automatic painting and things. Were these aspects that, I don't know if she wrote about this, but were these aspects of herself that she was expressing, or were these coming from other entities?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question. And she kind of leaves it a bit ambiguous in a lot of her writing. For her, it was more expansive than just the one individual psyche. It wasn't just this kind of psychological repressed desires coming through, this kind of Freudian approach. For her, she was very much open to entering sort of this animistic world, or kind of this sort of spiritual world, and letting other entities, or letting mysterious forces kind of channel through her. But she's not necessarily channeling any specific deity or any one spirit, even though I think she's written about kind of wanting to communicate with angels and things like this. But she's not very overt with exactly where her channeled working really comes from. But it was both spiritual and psychological. And for her, the division between the two really didn't exist. She writes in a questionnaire in a journal that she saw duality as the greatest heresy of man. That the divide between body and mind, and between spirit and the psyche, that was heretical. And so for her, these boundaries really weren't there.
So would she say that the imagination was this binding factor in all of these different planes of existence that we as human beings would experience?
Yeah.
A physical and a spiritual, that the imagination was something that connected everything together, or was
Probably,
I
maybe.
misunderstanding?
Yeah, I think so. I think this sort of the imagination is very much the entry point to both the deepest parts of the self, but then also the entry point into these ineffable sort of spiritual places or potentials as well, perhaps.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was just wondering, I'm trying to dig in my brain, but I can't remember. Do you know anything about her relationship with Leonora Carrington?
I think that they wrote letters,
Yeah.
but I'm not sure. They weren't very close. I don't think they were confidants.
Okay. Right.
Yeah, not like Remedios Varo and Leonora.
Yeah, right.
Varo and Carrington. Yeah.
They were just part of the Seguliers
Mhm.
in my paternal
Yeah,
family.
yeah. I'm sure that they crossed paths, and I believe that there were letters exchanged, but I'm not sure the extent.
Right.
She doesn't really, at least from what I've read,
Okay.
that's not there. I'm not sure.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, I'd be
Okay.
curious as well.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. Okay, I think we've reached the natural end to this discussion, so thank you very much